At 14 minutes past 3 on a Tuesday morning, Santino Orsini opened his eyes in a white room and needed almost 10 full seconds to understand where he was. The first thing he saw was not the ceiling, not the machine ticking away on his left, but Tessa Merrick, the housemaid he had pushed out of his sight, for 11 months asleep, with her forehead resting against the side of his hospital bed. For a moment, he thought the pain medication had invented her. In Baltimore, there were 7 men who would lose everything if he said one sentence, and more than 200 people who worked under the Orsini name. Not one of them was in that room. On the small table stood only 2 empty coffee cups, a neat stack of insurance forms, and a visitor badge stuck crookedly to her shoulder on the same clothes she had been wearing since Friday evening when he walked out the door without looking back. Her hand was still curled around the metal bed rail, as if she had fallen asleep in the middle of making sure he could not disappear. For 11 months they had lived under the same roof and exchanged exactly 3 sentences, all 3 about schedules. He tried to say her name. What came out of his throat was a rough, broken breath. But her eyes opened immediately, and for one brief second, before she could rebuild every defense she owned, she looked at him the way a person looks at something they had already given up for lost. Santino Orsini had never in his life received a kindness that did not come with an invoice attached. That night, for the first time, he had no idea what he owed, or to whom. If this story reaches you, leave a like so I know you're still listening. Share it with the person you once forgot to thank. And subscribe, so you can walk the rest of this road with Santino and Tessa in the minutes to come. 3 days earlier, on Friday morning, Santino Orsini sat in his second-floor study and signed the papers one by one, never reading any sheet twice. Augustin Pell stood to the left of the desk, a leather-bound notebook in his hand, reading out the week's schedule in the steady voice of a man who had been doing this for 15 years. The call from the port came at 9 o'clock, a manager asking for 3 more days for a shipment that had been held. Santino listened to everything, then spoke exactly 1 sentence into the receiver. "You have until the end of tomorrow." He hung up before the man had time to thank him. Someone had been waiting in the hallway since early that morning, and no one knocked on the door. Pell turned to the next page, reminded him about the Friday afternoon meeting in Fells Point, mentioned the evening drive, then closed the notebook and said he should take it easy over the weekend. Santino didn't answer. He was signing the last page when there came a knock at the door. 2 light, brief taps. Tessa Merrick stepped inside carrying a stack of inventory sheets that needed signatures confirming receipt. She stopped 3 paces from the desk, far enough away that neither of them had to look directly at the other, and set the papers on the edge of the desk instead of handing them to him. It was the first time in 11 months that the 2 of them had been in the same room for more than 30 seconds. Pell glanced at her once, then looked away, the way a person might glance at a chair that had been moved to a different place. Santino pulled the stack toward himself. "Who told you to bring these up?" She said the kitchen had told her they were short-staffed. He asked where Maggie was. She said Mrs. Dupree was downstairs in the storeroom. He signed without looking up. She waited, both hands resting in front of her stomach, perfectly still. He pushed the papers back toward her. She picked them up, thanked him, and turned to leave. When she reached the door, she stopped. Santino noticed because, without realizing when it had happened, he had already lifted his eyes to watch her. She stood there with one hand on the doorknob and said something that didn't belong to any duty a housekeeper was supposed to perform. "Mr. Pell has changed your driving route 3 times this week." A very brief silence settled over the room. Pell didn't turn around. He merely opened his notebook and flipped a page, as though searching for something. Santino set his pen down. "Where did you get that information?" She didn't look at Pell. She looked directly at Santino, and that was the strangest thing about the entire morning, because in all 11 months she had never once looked him straight in the eyes. "I'm the one who cleans this desk." Pell gave a short, perfectly polite laugh, and said that schedule changes were normal, that Pier 7 was under repair, and the car couldn't take the usual route. Santino heard the explanation, and found it so reasonable that it didn't seem worth another thought. He had been hearing explanations like that from this man since he was 18 years old. This was the man who had once stepped in front of Santino's father during a night at the port and carried the consequences of that act for the rest of his life. There are certain kinds of loyalty a person doesn't test, not out of laziness, but because testing them feels like an insult. "Mind your own work," he said. His voice wasn't loud. He had never needed it to be. Tessa gave one short nod and opened the door. But she didn't step out right away. She remained in the doorway for another 2 seconds or so, And Santino, who had spent his entire life reading other people's hesitations, knew perfectly well that she was about to say one more thing. He also knew that all he had to do was ask a single word, and she would say it. He didn't ask. She closed the door behind her, the latch clicking so softly it was almost impossible to hear. Pell opened the notebook and continued reading the rest of the schedule. Santino picked up his pen, looked down at the paper in front of him, and for a moment couldn't remember what he had been about to sign. At 9:15 on Friday morning, there were 3 people in that room, and only one of them had spoken the truth. That person was the housekeeper, and no one believed her. In the house in Roland Park, there was a set of rules no one had ever written down, and no one ever broke. Tessa worked the night shift in the East Wing, starting at 9 o'clock in the evening and ending at 5 o'clock in the morning. Santino came home after midnight and slept in the West Wing. If he went downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water, she had already left the kitchen before he arrived, because Maggie Dupree was the one who made the schedules, and she arranged them with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years running a household, making sure those 2 people were never in the same place at the same time. If Tessa cleaned the second-floor hallway, he used the back staircase. If he had guests, she stayed in the servants' quarters until the last car had gone through the gates. 11 months passed that way. No one raised their voice. No one explained anything. And if a stranger had come to stay in the house for a week, they would have believed those 2 people had never met. But there were certain things those rules couldn't touch. Every night, when Tessa finished her shift and passed through the kitchen, she left a small light burning on the counter. She never told anyone why, and Maggie had reminded her twice that leaving a light on all night was a waste. Tessa left it on anyway. Every winter, Santino's father's old wool coat, the one Santino never wore and wouldn't allow anyone to touch, was taken out of the closet, washed by hand, dried in a closed room, and hung back in exactly the same place. No one asked for it to be done. No one wrote it on the duty schedule. The bowl of chicken soup that appeared outside his bedroom door on the night he ran a high fever in February wasn't on any duty schedule either, and when he asked about it, the kitchen staff said they hadn't made it. He didn't ask again. There were things like that on the other side as well. The room Tessa rented on the south side of the city had a broken lock for nearly a year, and one night she came home from work to find that it had been replaced with a new one, with 2 keys resting on the table. The building manager said the landlord had ordered it replaced. The landlord said he hadn't replaced anything. She stood in the doorway, staring at the new lock for a long time, then slipped the keys into her pocket and didn't ask anyone else. She also didn't know that in the Orsini family's official personnel ledger, the one handed to the lawyers twice a year and targeted far more often than that by outsiders trying to get a look inside it, her name had been crossed out since the previous spring. She was paid in cash through Maggie, with no paperwork, no identification number, and no address stored anywhere in the system. For an ordinary housekeeper, that would have been a disadvantage. For a housekeeper working in this house, it was the only thing that made certain anyone who wanted to find her wouldn't be able to. Santino told himself he had done it because anyone inside the house could become a weakness, and closing a vulnerability was simply part of being the man in charge. Tessa told herself she left the light on because it was a habit from when Owen was still alive, when he used to come home late after his shift at the boatyard, and habits didn't need reasons. They both believed what they told themselves, or at least believed it enough that they didn't have to think any further. That evening, after Pell left, Earl Boyd drove Santino toward the gates on his way to Fells Point. Earl had been driving for the family since Santino was still a boy sitting in the back seat, not yet tall enough to reach his father's shoulder. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't make conversation, and for the first 20 minutes he did nothing but watch the road. Then, in the same ordinary tone someone might use to ask the time, he said that the night before, he had seen the kitchen light still burning close to 3 o'clock in the morning. Santino didn't answer. Earl nodded as though he had received an answer anyway, then asked another question in the same calm voice. "How long are you planning to keep her on the night shift?" The car passed through 3 intersections before Santino realized he wasn't going to answer that question. Not because he didn't want to, but because he had no answer to give. Earl's question wasn't new. It was only a way of giving a name to something Santino had known for 11 months, ever since an April night he had never told anyone about. That night, he came home earlier than usual and didn't want to go inside. He sat down on the back steps, on the 3rd step with the crack no one had ever bothered to repair, and had been there for about 10 minutes when Tessa came out carrying a bag of trash. She saw him and stopped. When a housekeeper found the master of the house sitting alone outside at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, the proper thing to do was turn around and go back inside. She didn't. She set the trash bag down, and when he said nothing, she sat beside him on the step, leaving just enough space between them that neither of them would have to explain anything. They sat in silence for a long time. Then he asked, only to break the quiet, whether the wooden box in the servants' quarters belonged to her, the one Maggie had twice suggested throwing away. She said it did. He asked what was inside. She said there was a boat. He thought he had misheard her. She explained that it was a small wooden boat, about half an arm long, one her husband had started building but hadn't lived long enough to finish. He had worked at a boatyard in Fells Point, and all his life he had built boats for other people, so he had wanted one of his own, even if it was only a model. The hull was still missing 7 wooden slats. She said the number with perfect calm, like someone reciting something she had counted many times. Santino asked why she didn't hire someone to finish it. She was quiet for a while, then said that if someone else finished it, it wouldn't be his boat anymore. It would only be an object. That sentence stayed with Santino longer than he wanted it to. They kept talking, and he learned that she had once studied nursing, that she had made it to her final year and had only 2 semesters left. He asked why she had quit. She said because someone had needed care more than she had needed a degree, and there wasn't a trace of regret in her voice when she said it. That was what made him stop asking questions. She told him she could still remember how to take a pulse, still remembered dosages, still remembered things that 3 years of scrubbing floors should have made her forget. He told her she should go back to school. She laughed, and it was the first time he had ever seen her laugh, and said that $74,000 in medical debt left behind was a difficult number to argue with. Then they fell silent again. The April air was warmer than usual. At some point, she leaned slightly to one side, and her shoulder touched his, and she didn't move away. Santino turned toward her. He hadn't meant to do anything, or at least that was what he would tell himself afterward. He turned, and through the opening at the collar of her shirt, he saw a silver chain, and hanging from the end of it was a man's wedding ring, far too large to have been hers. There are moments when a man has to choose between telling the truth and protecting himself. And Santino Orsini, a man who had never lost to anyone across a negotiating table, lost to himself in less than 2 seconds. Fear moved faster than honesty. He stood up. In the same even voice he used when ending a meeting, he told her that she had done good work, that he knew she felt indebted to this house for the job and for the place to live. But owing someone was one thing, and something else shouldn't be confused with it. Then he said the sentence that, 3 years later, he could still hear inside his own head. Don't mistake gratitude for something else. Someone like you should know where you stand. She didn't answer. She picked up the trash bag, walked out through the back gate, and he heard the lid of the trash bin close in the darkness. The next morning, there was a handwritten request on his desk asking to be transferred to the night shift, exactly 3 lines long, without a single unnecessary word. He picked up his pen, signed it, and told himself that this was what she wanted. 11 months later, sitting in the car with Earl's question hanging in the air between them, he finally understood that through all that time, he had never truly believed what he had told himself. At 4:10 on Friday morning, Tessa went down to the kitchen for water and saw that the garage lights were still on. That wasn't normal. She knew it wasn't normal, because every Thursday night, when she passed through the parking area to take out the trash, she was always the one who switched off that row of lights, and in 3 years, she had never forgotten once. She stopped beside the kitchen window. The garage door was open about halfway. Inside, Augustine Pell stood beside the black SUV with his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, talking to a man she had never seen in this house before. The man had his back to her, tall and thin, and he hadn't taken off his hat. From where she stood, about 40 paces away with 2 layers of glass between them, she couldn't hear a single word. She could only see Pell open the rear door of the vehicle, point to something inside, then close it again. The other man nodded. Neither of them shook hands. Her eyes shifted toward the service gate, the one used only by garbage trucks and delivery vehicles, and she saw a pickup truck parked outside, its lights off, its engine still running. Some people forget everything when they're afraid. Tessa was the opposite, and she knew why. In her final year of nursing school, they had taught her that when a patient took a turn for the worse at 3 o'clock in the morning, the thing that saved that person wasn't memory but a pen, and the order of what you wrote down had to remain fixed. First the time, then what you saw, then the numbers. That habit stayed with her longer than the degree she never earned. She opened the drawer beneath the kitchen counter, took out her expense notebook, the one she used to record grocery money and bus fare, turned to the back, and wrote 3 lines in small block letters. The time, the service gate, and the 7 characters on the pickup truck's license plate, visible only because the streetlight cast enough light across it. She closed the notebook, slipped it into her pocket, and finished drinking the glass of water, as though nothing had happened. Then she went upstairs to the 2nd floor and finished the rest of her work. She didn't tell anyone, not because she was afraid of Pell, but because she understood very clearly where she stood in this house. And 11 months earlier, someone had told her directly to her face exactly where that place was. If a housekeeper went around saying that the family advisor had met a stranger in the garage at 4 o'clock in the morning, she would lose her job before anyone bothered to verify a single word. She had seen it happen to a gardener the previous fall, but there was something else Tessa knew, and she knew it in the ordinary way people who worked inside a house came to know things. Once a month, during the 2nd week, the contractor that had installed the security system sent someone to service the cameras. They came during the day, and during the day Maggie was busy, Pell was busy, and Santino wasn't home, so the person who signed the maintenance receipt was whoever happened to be on the ground floor. For 3 years, that person had always been her. She had signed those papers around 30 times. She had stood beside the technician often enough to hear him complain that the server inside the house stored data for only 14 days before automatically overwriting it, while the complete backup was kept at his company's data center on the west side of the city, and every time someone wanted footage extracted, a formal request had to be submitted with the signature of the person whose name was on the contract. The name on that contract was Augustine Pell. The entire security system of this house, from the camera at the main gate to the camera at the service gate, from the electronic locks to the entry logs, was under his control. Tessa didn't think about any of that morning. She simply wrote 3 lines in an expense notebook, slipped it into her pocket, and went back to finish her shift. 17 hours later, on the road along the harbor, a white truck would cut across from the inside lane. At 9:43 that night, on the road along the harbor, rain had been falling since dusk, and the pavement had turned into a long ribbon of red lights stretching into the distance. Santino was driving himself. He always drove himself on Friday nights. It was a habit he had kept from the days when his father was still alive, and Earl had gone home at 7 o'clock. Santino had just left Fells Point, his mind still working through an unresolved question about the shipment at Pier 7, when a car ahead stopped in the outer lane and, from the inside lane, a white truck cut across. After that, nothing in his memory remained in order. The images lay scattered like a stack of photographs dropped onto the floor, taillights turning sideways, the sound of another car braking somewhere behind him, the feeling of pressing the brake pedal and knowing there wasn't enough time for anything to happen, then glass breaking, followed by a silence so brief that he still had time to think he could hear the rain more clearly than usual. Rain blew in through the broken window frame, cold and steady, touching his face. The dashboard went dark, then lit up again. Someone was pounding on what remained of the window. A stranger, a man's voice shouting that an ambulance was coming, shouting the same words over and over as though he were afraid everything would fall apart if he stopped speaking. Santino tried to reach for his phone. His hand touched the floor of the car and found pieces of black plastic. He thought, with complete and unreasonable clarity, that Maggie wouldn't know how to arrange the schedule tomorrow morning if he didn't come home. Then everything went completely dark. The police found his wallet beneath the passenger seat. His driver's license listed an address in Roland Park. The emergency contact card folded behind it was so old that the ink had blurred at one corner, and the telephone number written there belonged to Matteo Orsini, his older brother, who had died 3 years earlier. That number now belonged to an auto repair shop on the north side of the city, closed since 6 o'clock that evening. They called the house next. Rosalind Orsini was in Italy, 6 hours ahead, and her phone had been switched off after dinner. They called the 3rd number in the internal directory that the hospital was able to trace through the transportation company registered to the vehicle, Augustine Pell's number. There was one thing everyone who worked under the Orsini name knew by heart, and people spoke of it the way they spoke about the weather. Pell always answered his phone. Pell answered at 2 o'clock in the morning, at 3 o'clock in the morning, during his daughter's wedding, while sitting beside his wife in a hospital. In 15 years, no one had ever called him and needed to call a second time. That night, the hospital called once, and no one answered. They called a second time, and no one answered. The third call returned a busy signal before transferring to voicemail. The receptionist wrote 3 words on the form, unable to contact, then moved on to the next section, because to them, it was only 1 line on a form, and they still had 14 other cases that night. No one inside that hospital in eastern Baltimore understood that those 3 unanswered calls disappearing into empty space were the first piece of evidence, and that the record of them would sit untouched in the switchboard log for nearly a month before anyone thought to go looking for it. At 11 o'clock that night, the hallway outside the 3rd-floor surgical waiting area glowed under white lights and was almost empty. A man sat in the first row of chairs waiting for news about his mother. A woman stood beside the vending machine, pressing the button twice, but nothing came out. A television mounted on the wall played a weather report with the sound turned off. Somewhere inside that building, the man who controlled the ports on Baltimore's eastern side, the man whose single sentence could cost 7 other men everything they had, lay beyond 2 sets of doors with no one waiting for him at all. No mother, no advisor, no driver, not one of the more than 200 people who still received their pay under his name. The blue plastic chair across from the operating room door remained empty for the next 40 minutes. Then, at the far end of the hallway, the elevator doors opened. At 10:40 that night, 2 police officers knocked on the door of the house in Roland Park. Maggie Dupree answered in her robe and opened the door only wide enough to speak through it. She heard them say Santino Orsini's name, heard the word hospital, then told them the family was away, that she was only the housekeeper and had no authority to answer anything, and that they should contact the company office on Monday morning. She had worked in houses like this for 30 years, and she knew the first rule was never to say anything to someone in uniform at night. She closed the door. Tessa stood at the far end of the hallway, still holding a bucket of water, and she had heard everything. She could have turned around and gone back to work. That was the proper thing to do, the thing everyone in this house would have done, and it was also what her place required of her. She set the bucket down, walked past Maggie, opened the front door, and stepped out onto the porch in the rain. The 2 officers had already turned away and taken a few steps. They stopped. She asked only one word. Why? The older of the 2 turned and looked at her, taking in the work uniform and the wet canvas shoes, then asked who she was. She said she worked in the house. He told her that by regulation he was allowed to give information only to family members. She said there were no family members in this house right now. There was a silence, and in that silence Maggie stood behind her and called Tessa's name once, quietly. A warning. Tessa didn't turn around. The officer watched her for another second, then spoke. There had been a collision on the road along the harbor at 9:43. Mr. Orsini was at East Baltimore Hospital. They had called 3 numbers and hadn't been able to reach anyone. He said nothing more, because there was nothing more to say, and because he wasn't allowed to. Tessa thanked him. She went back inside, walked straight past Maggie, and Maggie called after her that she was doing something she would regret, that this family's business wasn't a servant's business, that if she walked out through those gates tonight, she shouldn't be surprised to find her name crossed off the duty schedule in the morning. Tessa didn't answer a single word. She went to her room, changed out of her wet uniform, put on a sweater and a coat, picked up her handbag, and on her way out turned into the kitchen to take the phone that was charging in the corner of the counter. The small light on the counter was still burning. She didn't turn it off. She called Earl Boyd. He answered on the second ring, his voice still thick with sleep, and after she finished 2 sentences, all he said was that he would be at the back gate in 15 minutes. He arrived in 11. The rain was still falling, not hard, but steady and persistent. After they had driven for a while, Earl glanced over at her. He had been driving for this family for nearly 20 years, and he understood very clearly what was happening to the woman sitting beside him, more clearly than she did herself. "Are you sure?" he asked. Tessa looked out through the window, at the rows of streetlights sliding backward behind them. "No," she said, "but there's no one there." Earl didn't ask another question. He simply pressed the accelerator a little harder, and for the rest of the drive, they sat in silence. In the pocket of Tessa's coat, the expense notebook was still there. The 3 lines of small block letters she had written before dawn that morning still unseen by anyone. She wasn't thinking about it. She wouldn't think about it again for many weeks. Right now there was only one image in her mind, and it wasn't an image from tonight. It was the image of another hospital corridor 3 years earlier, a drawbridge opening to let a ship pass, and a door she had reached 20 minutes too late. At the 3rd-floor reception desk, they asked who she was in relation to the patient. Tessa said she worked in his house. The woman behind the desk tapped a few keys, then said in the voice of someone who had repeated the same sentence thousands of times that medical information could only be given to family members or authorized representatives, and Tessa was neither. Tessa didn't argue. She had stood at a desk like this 3 years earlier, and she knew arguing wouldn't get anyone anywhere. She placed both hands on the counter and said, "Then tell me what he needs from home." The woman looked up. Perhaps because that wasn't the kind of question she usually heard close to midnight. She studied Tessa for a moment, then pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. His insurance card, the original if possible, a list of the medications the patient was taking. Photographs of the bottles would be enough. The automobile insurance policy number, and if there was anyone who could sign paperwork, that person should be brought in before morning. Tessa folded the paper, slipped it into her pocket, thanked her, and went back out to where Earl was waiting. An hour later, she was back in Roland Park. She went straight upstairs to the second floor, turned toward the west wing, and stopped outside Santino's bedroom door. In 3 years of working in this house, she had never stepped inside that room. It belonged to Maggie's section, and the unwritten rules of the house contained one very clear provision. The housekeeper assigned to the east wing didn't touch the west wing. She stood there for about 3 seconds. Then she opened the door and went in without asking anyone's permission and without telling anyone. She found the insurance card in the second drawer of the writing desk, beside a stack of documents she neither read nor turned through. There were 4 bottles of medication in the bathroom. She photographed all 4, making sure to capture both the pharmacy labels and the small print listing the dosages, because she remembered that people always asked about dosage. She took a clean set of clothes, a toothbrush, and the phone charger, then stopped in the middle of the room when she remembered that the phone itself was gone. She took the charger anyway. On the way back, she called the transportation company that owned the vehicle, located the towing yard, and asked them to keep the car in the secured section. The night attendant told her storage fees were charged by the day and had begun accumulating at midnight. She asked the rate, wrote it down, then called the insurance company and opened a claim at 1:15 in the morning, reading the policy number over the phone while Earl drove through the rain. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the pharmacist on the hospital's ground floor called the patient's name and said that one item on the prescription hadn't yet been approved by insurance, that it would have to be paid for first and appealed afterward, and that if they waited for approval it wouldn't happen until the beginning of the week. Tessa asked how much. The pharmacist gave her a number. She opened her bag, took out her bank card, and passed it through the opening beneath the glass. That account held every dollar she had managed to save over 3 years, week by week, for the semester she had walked away from long ago, and still hadn't stopped hoping she might someday return to. She didn't spend much time thinking about it. She signed the receipt, took the bag of medication, and carried it upstairs to the 3rd floor. Then she sat down in the blue plastic chair across from the operating room doors, the chair that had remained empty since 11 o'clock that night. She rested the stack of paperwork on her lap and arranged everything in order. The insurance card on top, the photographs of the medication bottles next, the claim number and the name of the person handling it written in small block letters in the corner of the page. In the hallway, the television mounted on the wall was still showing the news with the sound turned off. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease. Close to 3 o'clock in the morning, the operating room door opened, and a man in blue scrubs stepped into the hallway, pulled down his mask, and asked who there was family. Tessa stood up. The stack of papers on her lap slipped, and she caught it with one hand before it fell. The doctor looked at her, then glanced over her shoulder toward the far end of the hallway, where 2 rows of empty chairs and a vending machine stood beneath the fluorescent lights. He said nothing for about 2 seconds, and Tessa understood perfectly well what those 2 seconds meant. He was waiting. He was waiting for someone else to appear from somewhere. Someone wearing an expensive coat. Someone with the last name Orsini. Someone who could hear what he was about to say and carry those words to the place where they were supposed to go. She had seen that look 3 years earlier in another hospital corridor, and back then she had burst into tears. This time she didn't cry. She simply stood a little straighter. The woman at the reception desk, the same woman who had written out the list for her close to midnight, looked up from her screen and said in the ordinary voice of someone reading a line from a form, "She's the only one here." The doctor looked back at Tessa. Then he pulled over a chair and sat down, and that was when she knew he had decided to tell her. He said the surgery was over. There had been damage inside the abdomen, and they had taken care of it. His left knee was broken and had been stabilized. They would deal with that later. He had suffered a concussion and 3 broken ribs. The doctor said all of it in an even voice, without rushing, and Tessa nodded after each item as though she were writing everything down inside her head, because that was the only way she knew to keep herself from thinking about anything else. Then he stopped and told her the part that mattered most. The next 12 hours were what worried them. They would watch for swelling in the brain and monitor him for any further bleeding. If he made it through the morning and his numbers remained stable, everything would look different. If they didn't, they would have to operate again. He asked whether she understood. She said she did. His eyebrows lifted slightly because she understood more quickly than he had expected, but he didn't ask why. Before standing, he told her that by morning they would need a family member there, because there were decisions the hospital couldn't ask a housekeeper to make. Tessa said she would keep calling. He nodded and walked away. Half an hour later, an administrative employee brought down a stack of forms and placed them on the counter. There was a visitor registration form. There was a form confirming the insurance information. And there was a financial responsibility agreement, stating that whoever signed it accepted responsibility for any charges the insurance company refused to cover. The employee pushed the whole stack toward her and pointed to 3 places marked with yellow tabs. Tessa picked up the financial agreement and read it from beginning to end, including the small print on the back. She read slowly. Then she set it down, separated it from the rest of the stack, and pushed it back toward the employee. She said she wouldn't sign that one. The employee said it was standard procedure. She said she knew it was standard procedure, and she still wouldn't sign it, because she wasn't family, and she had no authority to take on another person's debt. She said it calmly, without raising her voice, and without offering another word of explanation. Some people, when exhaustion overtakes them, will sign anything placed in front of them. Tessa Merrick had carried $74,000 in medical debt on her back for 3 years, and she knew exactly what a single signature could do to the rest of a person's life. She signed the other 2 forms. On the visitor registration form, she wrote her own name, and in the space asking her relationship to the patient, she hesitated for exactly 1 beat before writing 2 words, household staff. At 4:15 in the morning, Santino Orsini was transferred to a monitoring room on the 5th floor. Tessa followed through the hallway, walking about 3 steps behind the rolling bed, and when the elevator doors closed, she was the only person inside with him. There was a nurse working the night shift on the 5th floor, and later she was the one who told the story of those 3 days and 3 nights, because she was the only person who witnessed almost all of it. She said she had worked on that floor for more than 10 years, and had seen every kind of person sitting beside a hospital bed. People who cried, people who prayed, people who sat tapping at their phones and went home after half an hour. She had never seen anyone do what that woman did. That woman talked. She talked constantly. She talked to a man who lay perfectly still, who didn't respond, who didn't open his eyes. And she spoke in the ordinary voice of someone giving a work report, not the voice of someone begging for mercy. On Saturday morning, the nurse heard her reading out the day's list of tasks. The 2nd floor had been finished by 11 o'clock. The guest room sheets had been changed. The washing machine in the servants' quarters was leaking again from the pipe underneath. Towels had been stuffed around it for the time being, and a repairman would have to be called on Monday. She went through every item, missing nothing, as though someone on the other end were nodding along. The nurse said she stood outside the door listening for about a minute, then moved on because she didn't know what she was supposed to say. At noon on Sunday, Tessa talked about the weather. She said the rain had stopped outside, said the wind coming in from the bay felt colder than the day before, said that if Monday turned sunny, Mrs. Dupree would take down every curtain in the west wing to wash them, and then everyone's entire Monday would be ruined. She said that and laughed to herself. By afternoon, she was complaining about the coffee downstairs. She said that coffee wasn't coffee at all. It was colored hot water, and it cost more than a decent breakfast at the corner place near the bus station. She said next time he ought to have someone buy a coffee machine for the floor, as an act of charity. The nurse said it was the first time she had heard even a trace of irritation in Tessa's voice. On Sunday night, she told him about the hinge. She said the east window in his study had a hinge that squeaked, very softly, so softly you could only hear it when no one in the room was speaking. She said she had oiled it 3 times. The first time was in the fall of the previous year, the second in January, and the third 2 weeks ago. It still squeaked, because that hinge needed replacing. Not oiling, but replacing it required permission. And getting permission meant going through Mrs. Dupree and Mrs. Dupree would ask why the housekeeper from the East Wing cared about a window in the West Wing. She said he had sat in that room for 3 years and had never heard that sound even once. Then she fell silent for a very long time. The nurse said she remembered that silence more clearly than anything else Tessa had said. On Monday morning, Tessa went down to the ground floor, washed her face in the public restroom, bought a toothbrush and a tube of toothpaste, then went back upstairs. At noon that day, she made 3 calls. 1 to the insurance company, 1 to the towing yard, and 1 to the manager at the transportation company, and in all 3 conversations she spoke with the calm voice of someone who had prepared every sentence in advance. On Monday afternoon, the doctor said the numbers had stabilized. She thanked him, sat down, and said nothing more for over an hour. The nurse brought her a thin blanket close to 11 o'clock that night. Tessa accepted it, said thank you, and remained sitting upright in the chair for a long time afterward. The nurse said she made her rounds at 1 o'clock, and Tessa was still sitting there. At 2 o'clock, when she passed the room again, Tessa had pulled the chair close to the side of the bed, folded her arms along the edge of the mattress, and lowered her head onto them. The nurse said she stood watching for a few seconds, then dimmed one of the lights in the corner of the room and quietly pulled the door closed. It was 2:10 on Tuesday morning. After the doctor on duty left and the door closed behind him, the only sounds in the room were the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the soft rain against the window. Santino tried to lift his right hand and found it heavy, as though it didn't belong to him. "Don't," Tessa said immediately. "You have 3 broken ribs, an abdominal injury that's already been treated, a broken left knee, and a concussion." He looked at her. "You memorized my entire list of injuries. I like having complete information, still as troublesome as ever. You're still alive." He fell silent. That sentence stopped him more effectively than any dose of medicine could have. After a while, he asked what day it was. She told him it was Tuesday. He closed his eyes, made a very slow calculation inside his aching head, then opened them again. "You've been here since Friday night. Technically, since early Saturday morning. That chair is terrible. I know. I'm going to complain. Go ahead. They'll ask what you are to me." He laughed, and laughing hurt, and he had to lie still for a while before he could breathe normally again. She handed him a cup of water with a straw, held it while he drank, then set it back on the table. Outside, dawn hadn't come yet. The machine kept beeping at its steady rhythm. Santino stared at the ceiling for about half a minute before speaking again, and there was no humor left in his voice. "The police coming to the house explains why you came." She didn't answer. "It doesn't explain why you stayed." A long silence settled over the room. Tessa looked down at her hands resting in her lap. Then she pushed the chair back a little and sat straighter, like someone preparing to read aloud something difficult. "My husband died 3 years ago," she said, "in a hospital." Santino knew she had once been married. The ring hanging from the chain around her neck had told him that on an April night that both of them in this room remembered, and neither of them ever mentioned. But she had never told him how her husband died. "He worked at a boatyard in Fells Point," she continued. "There was a fire at the yard. They took him to the hospital at almost 7 o'clock that evening." She spoke in the same calm voice the nurse had heard throughout the past 3 days, the voice of someone giving a work report. "I was working a double shift on the other side of the city. The hospital called at 7:10. I told the person on duty that I'd be there in 40 minutes. I remember very clearly that I said 40 minutes because I'd already calculated the route in my head before I picked up the phone." She paused for a moment. "When I reached the drawbridge, it opened to let a ship through. A cargo ship. I sat on the bus and watched it pass." Santino said nothing. He knew that bridge well. He knew those ships well. Some of those cargo vessels belonged to the very company that carried his name. 40 minutes became an hour and a half, she said. "I got there at 8:45. He died at 8:25. She said that final time exactly the way she had written those 3 lines in her expense notebook. No trembling, no break in her voice, not a single tear. And because of that, the sentence went straight into the center of Santino's chest and stayed there. He had seen men cry. He had seen people kneel in front of him and beg, and none of it had ever touched him. What touched him was a woman saying 20 minutes in the voice of someone who had counted them every day for 3 years until they could no longer make her cry. "Tessa," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her name in 11 months. She looked up. "I know I'm not him," he said. She shook her head. very slightly. "I don't mistake you for him," she said. "I never have." Santino lay still for a while. He was still staring at the ceiling, and he knew that if he didn't ask now, he would never ask at all, because by morning there would be doctors, there would be nurses, there would be people from the company, and this opening between them would close. "So you stayed because of your husband," he said. It wasn't a question. He said it as though he were setting something heavy down on a table. It was also the way out he had deliberately left open for both of them, because if she nodded, everything could stop there. It could become something simple enough to understand. A woman who had arrived 20 minutes too late 3 years ago and didn't want to be too late again. He almost hoped she would nod. Tessa was silent for a very long time, long enough for him to hear the machine to his left beep 7 times. She looked down at her hands, red and cracked, fingers that had gone 3 days with nothing to do. "At first," she said. "Maybe." He waited. He didn't press her. Throughout his entire life and the work he did, Santino Orsini had known that the most valuable thing in any negotiation was the ability to remain silent longer than the person sitting across from you, and this was the first time he had ever used that ability without wanting to win. "After that," Tessa said, "I stayed because it was you." The pressure in the room changed. Nothing fell. Nothing broke. The machine continued beeping at the same steady rhythm, and outside dawn still hadn't come, but something had just been spoken aloud, something that couldn't be taken back, and they both knew it. Tessa was still looking down at her hands. She didn't raise her eyes to see how he would react, and Santino understood why. She was afraid. She was afraid in exactly the way he was afraid, perhaps even more, because she was the one standing on the weaker side inside that house, and the person on the weaker side always paid a higher price for speaking one sentence. He lay there knowing that all he had to do was say one right thing, and the past 11 months would end in that very second. He hadn't said it on an April night on the back steps. He didn't say it now either. "You still have the key to the East Wing," he said. It was the most trivial thing he could think of, and that was exactly why he chose it. Tessa looked up. She looked at him, and for one moment she understood exactly what he had just done, and he saw that she understood. "You never asked for it back," she said. "I thought you'd returned it to Mrs. Dupree." "No." "Why?" She let the question hang for exactly 1 beat. "For the same reason you never asked for it back." Santino turned his face toward the window. Outside, beyond the buildings, the sky was still dark, but it was no longer as black as before, the kind of gray a person only noticed after being awake for many hours. He thought about the key to the East Wing. He knew it was still in the pocket of her coat, together with the expense notebook he had never seen. He thought about how he should have asked for that key 11 months ago, because that was the rule, because anyone transferred to another shift was supposed to turn in their key. He hadn't asked. He had signed the 3-line request, pushed it aside, and never said a word to Maggie about the key. He had never asked himself why, and now, lying in this room, he didn't need to ask anymore. Outside, the sky had turned completely gray, that motionless shade of gray that comes just before sunrise. Santino turned back and asked a question he hadn't meant to ask. "Do you like the night shift?" Tessa looked at him as though he had suddenly spoken another language. "Nobody likes the night shift." "Then why did you ask to be transferred?" "I didn't ask," she said. "I wrote the request because Mrs. Dupree told me to. She said it was your order." A brief silence followed. "I never gave that order," he said. She said nothing. Then she spoke again, more slowly. "She said you'd already decided. She said if I didn't write the request myself, it would count as a reassignment, and a reassignment would look bad on my record. I only signed the request that was put on my desk." "Then who told her?" Santino didn't answer right away. He was rearranging something in his mind, and every piece was falling into the same place. "Did you receive the year-end bonus last year?" he asked. "What bonus?" "I approved one for everyone who worked in the house. Cash, through Mrs. Dupree. I received the night shift amount." He gave her a number. She gave him another, much smaller one. They both fell silent. "She told me mine had been reduced because I transferred shifts in the middle of the year," Tessa said. "I don't have any rule like that." He looked up at the ceiling. "Whoever told Mrs. Dupree to cut your hours was probably the same person who told her to reduce that payment." Tessa didn't say the name. She didn't need to, but she remembered 4:10 on Friday morning, remembered the garage door standing halfway open, and she opened her mouth to speak, then stopped, because she had been telling herself since that morning that a housekeeper didn't talk about things like that. Santino spoke first. On Friday, you told me my driving route had been changed 3 times. Yes. 3 times in 1 week is a lot. He said it, and lay still, and Tessa could see that he was genuinely considering it. She waited. Then he shook his head very slightly, the kind of movement a man makes when he is closing a door inside himself. Pier 7 is under repair, he said, and he's been with my father for 15 years. One night at the port, someone fired at my father, and he was the man who stepped in front of him. He carried the consequences of that night for the rest of his life. My father is gone, but he's still here. He finished speaking and exhaled, and the pain in his ribs forced him to stop. There are some things you don't investigate, he said, not because you're lazy. Tessa looked at him, and she understood that the door he had just closed wouldn't open because of anything she could say. She let it stay closed. And the lock on my apartment? She said. What lock? Last November. Someone replaced it one night while I was at work. Santino didn't answer. That was all the answer she needed. She gave one very small nod. And the bowl of chicken soup in February, he said. The kitchen said they didn't make it. They were telling the truth. I thanked Mrs. Dupree. And she accepted the thanks, didn't she? Very naturally. Tessa laughed. It was the first real laugh she had made in 3 days, and Santino laughed with her. Then the pain caught him again, and he had to lie still and breathe. And the kitchen light, he said once he could breathe properly again. She said nothing. I always thought someone kept forgetting to turn it off. For 3 years, I'm not good at that sort of thing. No, she said, you're not. Then they both fell silent. And this time the silence was unlike any silence they had shared during the past 11 months. It was warm. It wasn't a wall. It was a door they were both standing in front of, and neither of them yet knew how to open it. Just before 6 o'clock, the door to the room opened, and a nurse pushed in the morning treatment cart, its wheels rolling softly across the floor. Tessa stood and pulled her chair back to make room. As she did, the back of her hand brushed against his hand, resting near the edge of the bed. She could have pulled away. She left it there for exactly 1 second before moving it. By noon, the room was no longer the room it had been the night before. Rosalind Orsini arrived at 11:30, having taken the earliest flight from Milan and come straight from the airport, and she walked in with the bearing of a woman who had never had to wait for anyone to open a door for her. She stood at the foot of the bed and looked at her son for about 10 seconds without crying, then turned and asked the nurse for the name of the attending physician, asked which unit had private rooms available, and asked who had signed the admission paperwork. The nurse said a woman had taken care of the administrative matters. Rosalind asked which woman. No one could give her a proper answer. Cordelia Vance arrived shortly after her, carrying flowers and a folder of documents that she set on a chair and never opened once. She asked Santino how he was feeling, and after he managed 3 sentences, she sat down beside the bed with the ease of someone who had done it many times before, though in truth it was the first time. Milo arrived with his nanny, stood in the doorway for a while before coming in. He was 9 years old, the son of Santino's late brother, and for the past 3 years Santino had been his guardian. The boy didn't dare go near the bed. Santino had to call his name twice. Then Milo came over, stood close to the edge of the mattress, and asked whether his uncle was in pain. Santino said not too much. Milo asked when he was coming home. Santino said by the weekend. The boy nodded, then sat down in the blue plastic chair beside the bed, his feet not touching the floor, and stayed there quietly for nearly half an hour, occasionally looking at the machine that kept beeping. When Rosalind said it was time to leave for tutoring, the nanny let him out. Milo turned back at the door and gave one small wave. Santino waved back with the hand he could still move. Pell arrived about 15 minutes later. He came in wearing the face of a man who had gone 4 days without sleep and began apologizing from the doorway, saying he had been in Philadelphia handling the cold storage contract, saying his phone had broken, and that he hadn't learned what happened until Monday morning through the office, saying he had driven through the night. He gave so many details that no one thought to question any of them. He took Santino's hand in both of his, and Rosalind thanked him for taking care of everything, and he said it was his duty. Then he pulled out the leather-bound notebook and began reporting the decisions that needed to be made that week, in the same steady voice Santino had been hearing for 15 years. Santino listened for about 2 minutes. Then he turned his head to the right, searching for something he didn't give a name to, even inside his own mind. The chair beside the bed was empty. He looked toward the door, People moved through the hallway, but none of them were her. He looked down at the small bedside table. The insurance documents were arranged there in a neat stack, the card on top, the copies beneath it, and clipped to the outside was a handwritten sheet covered in small, precise block letters. The claim number, the name and extension of the person handling the case at the insurance company, the deadline for submitting additional paperwork, circled, the name of the towing yard, its address, the daily storage fee, and a note saying the vehicle had been requested to remain in the secured section. 3 medication charges that hadn't yet been approved, with the second one marked by an asterisk and a reminder that an appeal had to be filed within 15 days. At the very bottom of the page, beneath everything else, there was one line written even smaller than the rest. Your family is here. Don't argue with the nurses. There was no name, no signature. Santino read that line twice. Pell was still reading his report. Rosalind was still questioning the nurse about a private room. Cordelia was still sitting there. There were 4 adults in the room. There were flowers. There were documents. There were voices. And Santino Orsini lay in the middle of all of it, holding an unsigned sheet of paper, and for the first time since waking up, he felt the room become empty. The following Friday morning, the doctor said Santino could go home, but someone had to stay with him for the first 48 hours. Someone who knew how to recognize warning signs and knew whom to call if something went wrong. Rosalind said she had 3 meetings that couldn't be moved and a flight to Philadelphia on Sunday, but she would hire a private nurse, the best available, and could have one there that very afternoon. Cordelia said she could stay. She was free all weekend, and she said it in the gentle voice of someone who knew she was offering something larger than the thing being spoken aloud. Santino hadn't had time to answer when there was a knock at the door. Tessa stood in the doorway wearing her coat, her handbag in one hand. She looked at Rosalind first, then at Cordelia, and only then at him. I can stay, she said. Rosalind turned fully toward her. Cordelia smiled the way people smile when they don't yet understand what is happening. This isn't a declaration, Tessa continued, speaking to the entire room rather than to anyone in particular. My room is 30 paces from his. I work nights, so I'm already awake during the hours someone needs to be awake. And I know how to change a dressing. Rosalind asked who she was. The nurse standing in the doorway said, in the calm voice of someone who had been on that floor all week, that this was the woman who had stayed since early Saturday morning. Rosalind said nothing more. She studied Tessa for a few more seconds, the look of someone filing away a piece of information for later use, then picked up her bag and said she would stop by on Sunday. Earl drove them back to Roland Park close to noon. It took Santino 15 minutes to get from the car to the living room, because every few steps he had to stop. Tessa walked on his left side and didn't support him unless he started to lean. And whenever she did support him, she placed her hands in exactly the right place and used exactly the right amount of pressure, like someone who had done this many times before, not someone merely trying to help. When they reached the sofa, she placed a hand beneath his elbow and lowered him slowly into the seat. As she bent forward, the handbag slung across her chest shifted. The flap came open, and a stack of papers slipped onto the floor. Tessa reached for them. She wasn't fast enough. Santino had already seen the printed line on the top page, the name of a nursing school in Charleston, South Carolina, and beneath it, in heavier type than everything else, the words admission letter. She picked up the papers, folded them, and put them back into her bag. Charleston, he said. She didn't answer. When? Classes start in 12 days. He fell silent. He looked at her handbag, the same bag she had carried into the hospital every day for the past week, the bag that had held her bank card at 4 o'clock that morning. How long have you known you were accepted? 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Yes. And you were planning to leave without telling anyone. I was planning to give Mrs. Dupree 1 week's notice, according to the rules, she said. That's what I'm supposed to do. I didn't ask about the rules. Tessa straightened. She let both hands fall to her sides and looked at him with the expression of someone who was exhausted and had no desire to argue. What exactly do you want me to say? Were you planning to leave another list behind? The words came out sharper than he intended. She didn't step back. What did you want me to do? She asked. Knock on the door of your study, stand 3 paces from your desk like always, and tell you I was moving 800 miles away? After a year of us not even looking at each other? Yes. He said only that one word. Then he said nothing else. There was a reason already sitting inside him, and he knew exactly what it was. And he also knew that if he spoke it aloud, the papers inside her bag would become something entirely different. He didn't say it. He had had one April night to say it, and he hadn't. He had had one night in the hospital to say it, and instead, he had asked about a key. Tessa waited. She waited longer than necessary. Then she gave one very small nod, the precise nod of someone who had just received the answer she had already expected, and went to get his water and medication. That night, when he woke close to 3 o'clock in the morning because of the pain in his ribs, he looked down the hallway and saw, at the far end of the house in the kitchen, the small light on the counter still burning. On Sunday, Cordelia brought Milo over in the early afternoon. The boy brought his math homework with him and sat working at the dining table, occasionally running into the living room to ask his uncle a question before hurrying back again. Rosalind arrived half an hour later. Tessa was in the kitchen, standing beside the sink, and the kitchen opened into the dining room through a wide pass-through, so she could hear them, not because she wanted to listen. She heard Rosalind say that for 3 years the boy had been living in a house where no one took him to school, that a child like him needed a complete home, not a guardian who was always busy with meetings. She heard Rosalind mention 2 families, heard her say that these were the kinds of things people had to plan for in advance, instead of waiting until someone ended up in a hospital before thinking about them. She heard Cordelia answer something softly, too softly for her to make out the words. Tessa turned off the faucet, dried her hands, and went to get her coat. She stood in her room for about 5 minutes, then took the coat off again and hung it back up, because someone had to remain with Santino during the first 48 hours, and she had said she could stay. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Cordelia took Milo home because the boy still had a music lesson. He said goodbye to his uncle at the door, told him he would come back on Wednesday, then went out to the car. Rosalind left shortly afterward. The house became quiet again. Tessa brought Santino his medication and water exactly on time, checked the dressing around his knee, wrote an update on the sheet clipped to the table, and said no more than 5 sentences throughout the entire evening. Close to 11 o'clock that night, after she had been back in the servants' quarters for a while, she heard the tap of crutches against the tiled hallway outside. The sound moved very slowly, stopped twice, then stopped completely outside her door. She opened it. Santino stood there with one hand on a crutch and the other gripping the doorframe, sweat across his forehead, because walking the full length of that hallway wasn't an easy thing for him in his condition. "You're not supposed to be walking," she said. "I know. Then come inside and sit down." "I'm not coming in." She remained in the doorway, blocking it, one hand still resting on the doorknob. "What did you hear this afternoon?" he asked. "I didn't hear anything. You put your coat on." She fell silent. "Mrs. Dupree told me." Tessa still said nothing. He looked at her, and he knew he was standing in exactly the same place he had run away from 11 months earlier, except this time his leg was broken, and he couldn't run anymore. "I woke up in that room," he said, "and the first thing I saw was the person I'd spent 11 months pretending I didn't love." The sentence fell between them. Tessa didn't move. She looked at him for a long time, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but didn't tremble. "You almost died," she said. "You just spent 4 days in a room with no one there. Gratitude when you're vulnerable can look a lot like love, Mr. Orsini. I know. I've sat beside a man's hospital bed before. This isn't gratitude. You can't know that for certain right now. Don't decide for me." She lifted her eyes to his, and this time there was something in them he had never seen before. Not anger, but something older than anger. "Like you decided for me that night?" He couldn't answer. "You stood up," she said. "You told me I owed this house, that I should know where I stood. You decided for me what I was feeling. I didn't even get the chance to open my mouth." A long silence followed. Outside, the night was dark and perfectly still. "Now you're deciding again," she said. "The only difference is that this time you're deciding in the opposite direction." Santino opened his mouth, then closed it again, because every sentence that came to mind was a defense, and he had lived long enough to know that defending himself now would be the worst thing he could do. "Go back to your room," Tessa said. "You're not supposed to stand for long." Then she closed the door gently, without slamming it, and the sound of the lock settling into place was louder than any door closing could have been. The following week, Santino called the insurance company, called the towing yard, called the hospital pharmacy, and asked them to send him every statement again. He did it because that was the kind of thing he knew how to do. He added up every charge one by one: the medication that hadn't been approved, the storage fees for the first 3 days, the deposit on the equipment rented by the hospital, the taxi fares she had paid when Earl wasn't on duty. He wrote a check and told Maggie to take it down to the servants' quarters. The next morning, the check came back, torn neatly in half, and slipped beneath his bedroom door. He looked for her all morning and finally found her behind the house, sitting on the back steps, on the third step with the crack no one had ever bothered to repair. She was peeling a basket of potatoes to help the kitchen staff. He crossed the dozen or so steps on his crutches, and she heard him coming but didn't turn around. "You're not allowed to spend your school money on me," he said. "It wasn't a loan." "Then what was it?" She kept peeling. "It was what needed to be done at the time." "No one made you do it." "No one made me." "Then why?" She didn't answer. And Santino, the man who had won hundreds of negotiations by remaining silent longer than the person across from him, was the one who couldn't endure the silence this time, because with every passing second, he saw more clearly the position he was standing in. A man on crutches, indebted to his own housekeeper, with no way to repay her. A chance to save someone this time? Is that it? The words escaped before he could stop them. The knife in Tessa's hand went still. She placed it carefully on the edge of the basket, then turned to look at him. He saw her face change, and in that moment he would have traded everything he owned to take the words back. "I'm sorry," he said. "No." She said the word very softly. "I just said something terrible. You just took the worst day of my life and used it against me," she said. "And you didn't use it because you wanted to understand me. You used it because my kindness made you uncomfortable, and you needed to turn it into something unhealthy, so you wouldn't have to owe anything to it anymore." He couldn't say a word. "You don't get to do that," she said. "Not with that." She stood up. She wiped her hands on the towel draped over the railing, and when she continued, her voice was still quiet, still steady, still the same voice the night nurse had heard for 3 straight days. "You wanted to know why I stayed," she said. "I already told you, in that hospital room, and you changed the subject to the key. So I'll tell you one more time. I stayed because I love you too." Santino stood perfectly still. The crutch beneath his hand tilted slightly, and he had to steady himself against it. "I loved you before that night in April," she said. "I loved you through 11 months of taking the back staircase, so I wouldn't have to see you. I loved you the night the police came to the door. And I loved you the night I sat in that hospital hallway, thinking the last thing you had said to me before the accident was to mind your own work." She stopped. "But love isn't enough," she said. "Not if every time you feel powerless, you make the person helping you feel ashamed. I've lived with poverty for 18 years, Mr. Orsini. I can endure being poor. I won't endure that." She bent down, lifted the basket of potatoes, and walked inside through the kitchen door. The door closed behind her. Santino remained alone in the backyard, on the very same steps where 11 months earlier he had stood up and walked away. He had thought surviving that night on the road along the harbor would be enough to make everything different. Standing there, he understood that he had been wrong, and that surviving wasn't the same thing as changing. 3 days later, Pell asked to speak with Santino in private. He brought a thin file with him and placed it on the desk in the second-floor study, then opened it 1 page at a time, exactly the way he had presented reports for 15 years. The first page was a bank statement. There was an unfamiliar deposit into the account, made 3 days before that Friday night on the road along the harbor, transferred from a Delaware entity whose owner no one had been able to trace. The name on the account was Tessa Merrick. The second page was a copy of the vehicle schedule for that week, the same one Pell had read aloud in the study on Friday morning. And in the lower corner was a fingerprint that had been matched. Pell said he hadn't wanted to believe it. He said he had spent 3 nights thinking before bringing this upstairs. He said the person inside the house was always the easiest point of access, and that none of this was Santino's fault. He said all of it in the voice of a man whose heart was breaking. Santino sat perfectly still. Then he reached for the telephone. He had no intention of arguing with the file. He was going to do what he always did, make 2 calls, and by that afternoon the Delaware entity would no longer exist, and no one in Baltimore would ever mention the name Tessa Merrick again. "Put the phone down." Tessa was standing in the doorway. No one knew how long she had been there. She stepped inside, and this time, she didn't stop 3 paces from the desk as she had for the past 3 years. She walked straight up to it. "If you deal with this for me," she said, "then for the rest of my life I'll only be someone you chose to spare." She placed a small, hardbound notebook on the desk, the kind sold in grocery stores, its edges worn from use. It was the expense notebook where she recorded grocery money and bus fare. She opened it to the back, where 3 lines had been written in small block letters. The time. the service gate, and the 7 characters from the license plate of a pickup truck. 4:10 on Friday morning, she said. I went downstairs to the kitchen for water. The garage lights were still on, and every Thursday night I'm the one who switches that row of lights off. Mr. Pell was standing in the garage with a man I'd never seen in this house before. Outside the service gate was this vehicle, with the engine still running. Pell laughed. He said she was desperate. He said 3 handwritten lines in a grocery notebook proved nothing, that anyone could have written them at any time. That's true, Tessa said. So I'm not showing you this to prove anything. I'm showing you where to look. Then she said the one thing no one else in that room had thought of. The server in the house only keeps data for 14 days before it overwrites itself. The footage from that day has been gone for a long time, but the complete backup is stored at the contractor's data center on the west side of the city, and they keep it for 18 months. Pell stopped laughing. Once a month they send someone here to service the system, she said. They come during the day. During the day Mrs. Dupree is busy, you're busy, and Mr. Orsini isn't home. The person who signs the maintenance form is whoever happens to be on the ground floor. For 3 years, that person has been me. I've signed around 30 of them. Every form has the contract number and the name of the technician in charge. She placed another sheet of paper on the desk, a copy of an old maintenance form folded into quarters. The contract is in your name, Mr. Pell, so I can't request the footage. But as the legal owner of this estate, Mr. Orsini can. Santino put the phone down. He didn't make the 2 calls he had been about to make. He made a different one. The footage arrived the following evening. The service gate camera showed a pickup truck stopping outside at 4 o'clock on Friday morning. At 4:02, the gate opened. The man who opened it had his back to the camera, but after walking 4 steps, he turned partly sideways, and no one needed to guess who he was. That same day, Santino had someone compare the switchboard records from the transportation company on Friday night. The hospital had called 3 times. All 3 calls had been routed by the system to the advisor's extension, and all 3 had been manually disconnected from that phone in less than 2 seconds. The phone hadn't been broken. He hadn't been in Philadelphia. He had been sitting at his own desk, and he had pressed the disconnect button 3 times. Santino sat for a very long time with the 2 sets of records in front of him. The white truck that had cut across the road along the harbor had never been an accident. But that wasn't the thing that made it hard for him to breathe. What made it hard for him to breathe was the 3 days that came afterward. 3 days when a man lay in a room with no one there, while the one person who always answered the phone sat in silence and waited to see how it would end. Augustine Pell was asked to come in on Thursday afternoon, at exactly the same time he had arrived every week for 15 years. He walked into the second-floor study with the leather-bound notebook in his hand, and he already knew there would be no report to read that day, because there were no papers on the desk. There was only Santino sitting in his chair, his crutch propped against the side, and an empty chair placed across from him. No one else was in the room. The door stood open. Pell sat down. He rested the notebook on his lap and folded both hands over it. Santino didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch long enough for both of them to understand that it was deliberate. Then he spoke. Slowly, evenly, without raising his voice on a single word. He said that on Monday morning, the complete financial records from the transportation company covering the past 15 years, including the subcontract agreements the advisor had signed and approved himself, had been sent by the family attorneys to the federal prosecutor's office for the District of Maryland. He said a copy of the service gate footage and the extracted switchboard logs from Friday night had been included in the same file. He said the operating contracts at 2 port terminals for which Pell was the named representative had been locked down that morning, his company accounts had been frozen, and his name had been removed from every authorization still in force. He said the 3 banks Pell regularly used had been notified, and the people Pell usually called when he needed a seat at a dinner table had received a different kind of call. Santino said all of it, in exactly the voice someone might use to read the weather. Pell listened to everything. He didn't argue once. He simply sat there, and when Santino stopped, he asked a single question. "What are you going to do to me?" "Nothing," Santino said. "You're lying." "No, your father wouldn't let this end here." "I know," Santino said. "My father also wouldn't let a man sit at his desk and disconnect 3 calls from a hospital. There are things my father would do that I won't, and there are things I will do that he wouldn't." Pell looked down at the notebook in his lap. "You once taught me," Santino said, that ending a man is the laziest way to deal with him. You told me that when I was 21, at Pier 3, and I've remembered it ever since." He paused for a moment. "I'm taking your advice. Then why don't you finish it?" Pell asked, and for the first time his voice cracked slightly. "You have enough people. You have enough reasons. Finish it, and everything ends in one night." Santino looked at him for a long time. "Because then you'd only have to suffer for one night," he said. "Losing everything and still having to live takes much longer." Pell had no answer for that. He sat there for another half-minute. During those 30 seconds, Santino thought about the man who had stepped in front of his father one night at the port and carried the consequences of that act for the rest of his life. And he understood that this was the very thing that had blinded him for 11 months, for 2 years, for 15 years. There are certain kinds of loyalty people don't question. Not because they're lazy, but because questioning them feels like an insult. And there are people who survive for a very long time because of exactly that. "I was in this house before you knew how to read," Pell said. "Yes," Santino said. "You can go now." No one came in to escort him out. No one stood waiting in the hallway. Santino didn't rise, and he didn't watch him leave. Augustine Pell stood up on his own, picked up his leather-bound notebook on his own, walked to the door on his own, and closed it behind himself. His footsteps traveled down the hallway, descended the stairs, then disappeared completely. In the study, the hinge on the east window gave a very soft squeak. This time, Santino heard it. Rosalind Orsini went down to the servants' quarters on Saturday morning, alone and without warning. It was the first time in 6 years that she had set foot in the row of rooms behind the house. She knocked. Tessa opened the door, and for 1 second she was about to say that she would come upstairs immediately. Then she realized Rosalind hadn't come to summon her for work. Rosalind stepped inside, looked around the small room with its single bed, 1 table, and 1 chair, then sat down without waiting to be invited. She placed a folder on the table. "I know about Mr. Pell," she said. "I know you were the one who found out. I also know my son owes you more than he could ever repay." Tessa said nothing. "So I won't insult you with a check," Rosalind said. "Open it." Tessa did. Inside was an acceptance letter from a nursing school in Boston, one of the best schools in the Northeast, far better than Charleston. A full scholarship, signed and stamped, with only the recipient's signature still missing. Along with it was a lease for an apartment 10 minutes from the school on foot, prepaid for 2 years, and there was a letter of commitment from a hospital, promising her a position immediately after graduation, with the starting salary written plainly on the page. Tessa read everything from top to bottom, slowly, without skipping a single line, exactly the way she had read the financial responsibility agreement at the hospital that night. "What do you want?" she asked. "You leave Baltimore," Rosalind said. "Not in hiding, not in shame. You go to school. You finish the profession you left behind, in a place where no one knows whose floors you once scrubbed." She said it very gently, without a single cruel word. That was what made it so difficult to resist. "I don't look down on you," Rosalind continued. "I look down on that position. If you stay here, then 20 years from now, at every party, at every funeral, there will always be someone whispering into another person's ear about what you used to do in this house. You can endure that. I can look at you and know you can endure it. But you will have to endure it until the day you die." Tessa closed the folder. She rested both hands on the cover. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She didn't push it back toward Rosalind immediately either. She let it remain there for a while longer, and Rosalind was perceptive enough to understand that the silence wasn't hesitation. "Ma'am," Tessa said, "I've been poor for 18 years. I know exactly what everything costs. I know what an education like this is worth. I also know the price of not having one." She pushed the folder back toward her. "There's only one thing I won't sell. You think he'll marry you?" "I don't think anything," Tessa said. "I'm not even sure I'll stay in this city, but if I leave, I'll leave because I choose to leave, not because someone paid me to go." Rosalind sat in silence. She studied the woman in front of her for a long time, with the look of someone reconsidering something she had already filed away in her mind the week before. Then she picked up the folder. She stood, smoothed the hem of her clothes, and walked toward the door. At the threshold she stopped. She didn't turn all the way around, only tilted her head enough to speak. "I married at 23, she said. "My family had nothing then. My mother-in-law once sat across from me exactly like this, She paused for a moment. Don't let anyone make you feel small. Not him. Not me. Then she left. Tessa remained standing in the middle of the room, listening to the sound of Rosalind's shoes fading down the hallway, and it was a long time before she finally sat down on the edge of the bed. The following Saturday morning, Earl's car was waiting in the courtyard with the trunk open, and inside were 1 suitcase and 2 bags. That was everything Tessa Merrick was taking with her after 3 years of living in this house. Maggie stood on the front steps with her arms folded across her chest, saying nothing, and she had been there since early morning. Tessa had just closed the trunk when she heard the tap of crutches against the pavement. Santino came out through the front door, one hand on a crutch, the other carrying something pressed against his chest. He moved very slowly, and no one dared step forward to help him. When he reached her, he set the object down on the trunk lid. It was a small wooden boat, about half an arm long. The hull was complete. The 7 missing wooden slats were there, fitted tightly together, sanded smooth, stained to match the older wood, though it was still possible to see which pieces were new because whoever had done the work hadn't tried to hide it. On the underside, near the keel, 3 letters had been carved with a knife, the cuts uneven, the kind of lettering left by a man carving his own name into something he had made with his hands. They were still untouched. Tessa stood perfectly still for a long time. She reached out and touched the edge of the hull, pulled her hand back, then touched it again. It was in my garage after the pipe burst last year, Santino said. I was the one who cleaned up down there. The water rose halfway up the box. I brought it inside, and I should have given it back to you that same day. She didn't ask why he hadn't. She knew why. I started repairing it months ago, he said. I ruined 9 slats before I managed to make the first decent one. Inside the boat lay a white envelope. Tessa picked it up. What's this? An apology with no request attached, he said. Read it whenever you want. Or don't read it at all. Then he straightened as much as the crutch allowed and said the rest out loud, in broad daylight, in the middle of the courtyard, with Earl standing beside the car door and Maggie on the steps, and he didn't lower his voice to keep either of them from hearing. I was cruel to you that night in April, he said, because I realized I needed you, and I didn't know what to do with needing someone. My whole life, no one has ever given me anything without handing me a bill with it. So when you gave me something that had no bill, I went looking for one. When I couldn't find it, I made one myself, by turning you into someone who owed me. He stopped to catch his breath, and the pain in his ribs forced him to pause longer than he wanted. You were right not to trust what I told you in the servants' quarters, he said. I'd just spent 4 days lying in a room with no one there. A confession made from a hospital bed deserves to be questioned. You had every right not to believe it. He looked directly at her. So I'm saying it again here. I'm clear-headed. I'm standing. And I know perfectly well you can still get into that car. I love you. I loved you before that rainy night on the road along the harbor. Long before that. And I love you enough not to ask you to make your life smaller so it can fit inside mine. He nodded toward the open trunk. Go to Charleston. I'll fly down when my leg can handle it. If you've changed your mind by then, I'll live with that too. Tessa looked down at the little boat for a while longer. Then she spoke without raising her eyes. The program has a campus in Baltimore, she said. Santino said nothing. I requested a transfer to the local campus after the accident. Why? She looked up. Because if I stayed then, I would never know for certain why I was staying. Whether it was because of you, or because I felt indebted to you, or because I was afraid to go far away. So I chose to leave. I thought leaving was how I could prove I was still myself. She set the envelope down beside the boat. This morning I finally understood, she said, that leaving just to prove I'm independent is another kind of fear. She stepped toward him. She stood closer than 3 paces, closer than she had ever stood in all 3 years. I'm not staying because you almost died, she said. I'm staying because you lived long enough to finally tell the truth. 6 months later, Tessa Merrick attended morning classes at the Baltimore campus and worked evening clinical shifts in the emergency department, the very department she had reached 20 minutes too late, 3 years earlier. She came home at 11 o'clock at night, completely exhausted, and still sat down to check Milo's homework before the boy went to bed, because her schedule and his happened to overlap during that one stretch of time. He had grown accustomed to having someone sit across from him every evening and ask why he had gotten that answer. The little wooden boat rested on a shelf in the living room, and no one ever explained to visiting guests where it had come from. On the exact day marking 6 months since that night on the road along the harbor, Santino went to the hospital for his final follow-up appointment, and they handed him a form to update his emergency contact information. He took the pen, wrote Tessa Merrick's name, and in the space asking her relationship to the patient, he wrote 2 words, life partner. He handed the form to her. Tessa read it twice, very slowly, exactly the way she always read everything before putting pen to paper, and only then did she sign the line beneath it. That night, he came home close to 3 o'clock in the morning after a long meeting at the port. The small light on the kitchen counter was still glowing, just as it had for the past 3 years. But this time, beneath that light, someone was sitting there with her head resting against her hand, waiting for him to come home. Some people enter our lives through the front door, loudly and full of promises. Others stand quietly by the back door for years, leaving a light on without ever asking anyone to be grateful. It is only when every front door has closed that we finally realize who was truly there all along. Life doesn't measure a person's worth by the title they carry or the wealth they hold in their hands, but by where they are on the night someone else needs them most. Quiet kindness is never lost. It simply travels a very long road before finding its way back. And sometimes, the only thing a person needs to hear isn't some grand promise at all, but one truthful sentence, spoken at the right moment, while there is still time. If Santino and Tessa's story left something in your heart, please leave a like, share this video with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And has there ever been someone in your life who quietly left a light burning while waiting for you to come home? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. Wishing you and your family abundant health, happiness, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.